Okay, so this is a very quick example of accessing SQL Server Express from .NET. So what I did was I created a very simple WPF application. All I did is add one button here. You can see this button, when you click it, calls button click 1. So if we switch over to the code, as you can see, this is the method that will be called by button click, and that's all this whole program is just that one button call, just to illustrate how to access SQL Server Express from .NET using ADO. So I can break this down from the beginning. So first thing we have to do is put together a connection string. Connection strings can be tricky. There's all kinds of variations to connection strings. Because there are all kinds of data sources you can use. In this case, we're using specifically SQL Server Express, so I'm just going to give you a hard example here that you can just emulate. So this is the connection string. And by the way, I got this code from the ADO.NET example over on MSDN. I just modified it to simplify it for illustration purposes. But anyways, the connection string is, you see here, we'll just break it down. The data source is the most significant piece. You could just copy the whole thing, and the only thing you have to change is the data source because it's specific to the instance and installation of your SQL Server Express. In my case, it's called David SQL, and if we switch over to SQL Server Management Studio, you can see this was the instance of the database that I created, and I named it David SQL. You could have named it anything. You could have named it, Hello World or, foliage trading or whatever. But in my case, it was David SQL, and that's reflected here in the connection string. So that's probably the only thing you need to change in the connection string in your code. You just copy everything else here, initial catalog equals trading. That refers to the table, the database that we'll be using, trading. For some reason they call it initial catalog, but I guess that's just a generic term for a subset of the data source. But anyway, and integrated security equals true. That just means that we'll be using Windows authentication security. So the other method would be to pass in username and password. In this case, we don't need it because we had installed it. Hopefully, you had installed SQL Server Express using Windows authentication. But anyway, so this is a connection string, and I put together a query string, and it's just simply select first name, last name from table names. Switch over to SQL Management Studio. As you can see, this is our table, table names, and these are the columns that I'll be querying. First name and last name, and I happen to have a query that was on my query screen. It's pretty much the same thing. It says select first name, last name from names. And by the way, here's the data that's in the table currently. So it goes on to declare that you're using this SQL connection, and as you can see, it uses the connection string that we had just defined up here. And likewise, for the command, we use the query string that we had defined up here. So that's one of the arguments that we pass in the SQL command. So with connection and command, we're going to go into this try block here and try to open this connection as defined by this string up here. So what happens after it opens a connection? Now, once it successfully opens a connection, you can actually execute, call the execute meter in this command object. Again, command object is from the SQL command class, and it will return it to this SQL data meter. And from here, you can actually read what's been returned back to reader, and it's going to go through a while loop until all the rows have been retrieved. And what it's doing here is it's actually going to write into the console. And what that means is it's going to go to this output window, which you'll see when I start executing. It actually appears down here, and it's breaking it down to the first and second elements of that query. So in this case, 0 would be equivalent to first name, and 1 would be equivalent to the last name. Now, and then it will close down the reader after it's done. So I'm just going to go ahead and run it, and I put a few breakpoints, debugger breakpoints, so that we can just follow along. So I'm going to start. All right, so here's my button. I'm going to click the button, which calls this button click 1, and it hits this breakpoint here. So I'm just going to step over it. You can actually hit F10 rather than click it on this toolbar up here. But I'm going to click on this toolbar, and it's going to continue on. Create the command. Now it's going to open it. Since it bypassed this connection.open, it means it was successful. Otherwise, it would have thrown an exception. So I'm going to go ahead and just cycle through this. And so I did the first read. I'm going to open this up so you see this a little more clearly. So it returned this first row, David Ng. So I'm going to continue cycling through it. It should return the next 2 rows. So you can see it returned second name, Hugh Jazz. Continue cycling through, and it should return the third name, Hugh Jamie. And once it runs out of rows, it goes to close,